Hello and welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Today's presentation is by Jamie Barron, our Mildred Londa Weisman Fellow. Jamie is a professor of film studies at the University of Alberta, Canada, and co-founder and co-director of Decalogue, a journal and book series discussing recent documentary films. She is also the founder and director of the experimental film, The Festival of Inappropriation, which is centered on found footage. Jamie is the author of 2 books on how audio, photos, film, and video footage can be taken from the original context and used to shape a viewer's perspective. Her first book, The Archive Effect, rethinks our definition of archival footage and examines how such footage can be reused in a variety of ways to construct particular understanding of the past. Jamie's more recent work from 2020 is titled Reuse, Abuse, Misuse, which examines the ethics of reusing existing recordings, particularly recordings of other people. The questions of when and to what degree the use of such footage is ethical has become ever more relevant in the age of social media. While at Radcliffe, Jamie is producing a biography of Shirley Clarke, a dancer, filmmaker, and video artist active throughout the mid-20th century. By chronicling Clarke's extraordinary life and wide-ranging artworks, Jamie threads together some of the most important art and social movements of the last century. Jamie loves traveling and taking first-year language courses. She can speak a bit of Mandarin, Hebrew, Arabic, and French. And I'm delighted to welcome her to the podium.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Claudia. First of all, I want to thank the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study for this incredible fellowship and for this opportunity to present my research to you today. I want to thank in particular Claudia, Jin, Elizabeth, Sharon, Allison, and Maria, who've all been wonderful hosts and organizers this year. And I want to thank my other fellows. Being in your presence has just been so inspiring this year. I also want to thank Dennis Doros, Amy Heller, and others at Milestone Films for all the research that they did about Clarke for the Project Shirley collection, which came out several years ago. I just want to say that my current project would not be possible without all the incredible work that they did researching and restoring Clarke's films. So I also want to preface this talk by saying that I know I'm speaking to 2 pretty distinct audiences today, some people who know nothing about Shirley Clarke, and other people who knew her better than I ever will, including, I believe on the Zoom, her daughter, Wendy. So I'm going to be mostly addressing people who don't know anything about Clarke, but hopefully there will be something in there as well for those who knew her well. So, when I first learned about Shirley Clarke, I was really interested in her as really the only woman making independent feature films in the United States in the 1960s. And she was really one of few women making feature films at all at that time. But as I started to look into her life, I realized that she was much more than just a female film pioneer, and that her life and career intersected with a number of major artistic and social movements of the mid-20th century. So I began to think of her life and career as a lens through which to better understand the moment in history of which she was a part. So just to give you a general sense of what her life was like. She started off as a dancer. She became an experimental documentary filmmaker. She made 3 of the most important films of the new American cinema. She helped found the Filmmakers Cooperative to distribute independent films. She became a pioneer of video, creating video happenings that demystified the then brand new video technology. And she also taught a new generation of filmmakers and artists at UCLA. But more than that, throughout her life, she used her art to challenge inherited social divisions and to cross between subcultures, generally unable to communicate with one another, using art as a means of gathering people across difference. So in this talk, I'm going to give kind of an overview of Clarke's life and career, while also focusing in on one of her most important films, The Cool World. So first, some music. August 1962. It's a hot day in Harlem. There are, as usual, a few people from the neighborhood standing around watching the film crew, but by now they are used to seeing this uncommon mixture of black and white people carting 35mm cameras around 145th Street. Producer Frederick Wiseman is standing to one side watching the proceedings, drinking in every detail of the filmmaking process. Although he will go on to produce, direct, and edit over 50 films, this is his very first time producing a film, and he is not entirely pleased with what his director has been doing. Just now, the director, Shirley Clarke, is shouting instructions about where the young actor, Hampton Clanton, should stand within the film frame. Clanton, who plays the lead character, Duke, is practicing his lines in his head as he waits for the cinematographer to set up the shot. Madeline Anderson, one of the first black women to direct a documentary, is, with the help of Shirley's daughter, Wendy, making sure the non-professional teenage actors are taken care of during the long days of shooting. Actor Carl Lee, who helped script and cast the film and also plays the character of Priest, stands to one side, knowing that this crew could never have been here in Harlem without his help. Meanwhile, the aspiring writer and poet June Jordan, who more or less accidentally had become Wiseman's assistant on set, is watching everything very closely, taking mental notes that will soon become a record of this idealistic project, doomed to fail in certain ways, and yet glorious in its unparalleled attempt to bring divided communities into dialogue with one another through cinema. It's a hot day on the set of The Cool World, the first feature shot on location in Harlem, where few white people these days dare, or perhaps bother, to go. It is less than a year before the neighborhood would erupt in protest against continued economic discrimination and police violence against African Americans. Jordan would literally be caught in the middle of these protests, taking shelter alongside one of the teenage actors from the film. How did this film happen? How did Shirley Clarke, a woman making independent features at a time when very few other women were making films at all, end up making this film, this incredibly significant but largely unseen film? We'll talk about that. But first, let's go back to the beginning, at least to Clarke's beginning. Shirley Brimberg was born on October 2nd, 1919, to a wealthy Jewish family living near Central Park in Manhattan. She was one of 3 daughters of Florence and Samuel Brimberg. Perhaps even more importantly, she was the granddaughter of Haman Rosenberg, known to his friends as H.R. Born in 1874, he had joined the wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing the pogroms to which Jewish communities in Latvia were regularly subjected. He arrived in New York City in 1893, unable to speak English, and with nothing to his name but the mind of an inventor. By the time he died in 1952, at the age of 78, H.R. held over 200 patents of screws and related devices and had become a self-made millionaire. So there was plenty of money in the family, but this did not, in fact, make for a happy childhood for the Brimberg girls. Shirley's father was by multiple accounts a mean bully, both physically and verbally abusive. He seemed to have wanted a son and was very dismissive of the ambitions of his 3 precocious daughters. Nevertheless, as children of a wealthy Jewish family in uptown Manhattan, it was only natural that the girls should attend the nearby Ethical Culture School and later the Lincoln School of Columbia Teachers College. So I got really interested in her educational background and how that led her to a particularly socially conscious kind of filmmaking. So the Ethical Culture School was an offshoot of the Ethical Culture Society founded by Felix Adler in the late 19th century as a new secular religion. Ethical culture rejected the idea of a personal deity available to human comprehension, focusing instead on the perfection of humanity in this world based in love and care for all human beings in the surrounding world. Basically, the ethical core of Judaism minus its theism and dogma. Adler found in Jewish education the basis for his progressive vision, and the Ethical Culture School offered this education to the children of the working poor of all ethnicities free of charge. Later on, financial considerations and interest from wealthier families led the school to admit some students who could pay tuition to help subsidize those who could not. Hence, it became a school remarkably diverse for the time in terms of both ethnicity and social class. And I think this was important because it sort of opened the doors, I think, for her to interact with people of different backgrounds. The philosophy of the school was deeply rooted in the belief that educating children is about bringing out their innate talents rather than just imposing something upon them. This was a very new idea at the time. Although Shirley only attended the ethical culture school for a few years, her enrollment there gives a sense of the kinds of values of the particular subculture within which she was raised. The Brimberg sisters attended high school at the Lincoln School of Columbia Teachers College, one of the first lab schools for trying out progressive ideas in education, again tapping into children's innate curiosity and helping them see the relevance of their new skills to the world around them. Clark was dyslexic at a time when dyslexia was not a known condition, so she struggled somewhat in school. It seemed that everyone at Lincoln had some special talent that defined their identity, but no one in her class was a dancer. So after attending an inspiring dance performance at the Met Opera, that is what Shirley became. Fortunately, the 92nd Street Young Men and Women's Hebrew Association, also known as the 92nd Street Y, was just around the corner from where Shirley's family lived. In 1936, a man named William Kolodny had invited the innovative dancer Martha Graham to teach at the Y. Graham had been having trouble finding an audience for her new form of dance. The Jewish community appeared to be the ones most interested in this emergent art form. During the late 1930s, Clark became a student at the Y and trained there with Graham and other early great modern dancers to become a professional dancer. So that's her. In 1943, Shirley married Bert Clark, and in 1944, she gave birth to their daughter, Wendy. In the years that followed, she continued dancing, but Wendy recalls her mother venting her frustration that she felt she would never be a truly great dancer. She and Bert had received a 16mm camera for their wedding, however, so she decided to start shooting dance films instead. So one of my questions was, how did this sort of conservatively dressed, good Jewish girl become a central figure in the New York avant-garde film scene? Because she looks quite different later. So she goes through a real transformation during this period. So for some context. So Cinema 16 was founded by Amos Vogel and his wife, Marcia Vogel. Amos Vogel arrived in New York at age 17, he and his family having fled the Nazis' occupation of his native Vienna. Vogel was a man genuinely curious about the world. He was aware that there were many types of films that he wanted to see: science films, documentary, avant-garde films that could not be seen in New York at the time. Believing that there must be others interested in such films, in 1947, Amos and his wife Marcia together founded Cinema 16, the first cine club or film society in the United States. Although I can't be sure that Shirley Clark attended the show, the very first film screened at Cinema 16 was Lamentation, a film of Martha Graham performing her dance of the same name, so it is not implausible to imagine that Clark would have been in the audience that first night. Regardless, there is no doubt she spent a great deal of time at Cinema 16 and got to know the Vogels well. The filmmaker Jonas Mekas referred to Cinema 16 as his university, and I imagine it served Clark in this way as well. Perhaps the films she saw at Cinema 16 were what inspired Clark to take film classes at City College. In 1941, documentary producer Irving Jacoby founded the Institute of Film Techniques to make documentary films to counter the Nazis' propaganda films. His classes focused on socially conscious documentaries and featured prominent anti-fascist filmmakers as guest lecturers. Hans Richter, an experimental filmmaker and painter from Germany who had been forced into exile for advocating for freedom of expression under the Nazis, took over the program after Jacoby. Richter was one of the founders of Dadaism, an artistic movement that parodied and dismantled social conventions. This is the program, forged by Jacoby and Richter, that Clark attended, paving her way toward both socially conscious documentary style films and the avant-garde. So her early films were dance films. She said that she really didn't like any of the dance films that were out there, so she decided to make her own. So she spoke of her dance films in terms of destroying one art to create another, right? She really wanted to make films that weren't just filmed dances, but rather that used the cinematic medium to create a kind of dance that could not exist in, the physical world. So for instance, in Dance in the Sun, this is the dancer Daniel Nagrin, who became a very important dancer and choreographer, but she had him dancing on a beach and then performing the same dance in a studio. And then she initially, I think, didn't realize that she wanted to combine these things. She didn't like the footage she had, but when she combined them together, she would have him start a movement, or she would take footage of him starting a movement on the beach and finishing the movement in the studio so that it would, create this dance movement in a sort of impossible space. So there was another filmmaker, Maya Deren, who was doing something kind of similar at the time, but this was a very new way of using film and also combining dance with film. But she was also interested in how dance was part of everyday life. She was interested in sort of everyday movements and then how she could use cinema to explore those movements, to choreograph them, to edit them together into something like a dance. So in Paris Parks, which she made in 1954, was basically just footage of kids playing at a park in Paris. But if you watch the film, the way that it's edited, right, really turns it into a dance. I won't talk too much about this now, but she did also collaborate with the dancer Anna Sokolow, who's a really important modern dancer for two films, Bullfight and A Moment in Love. And again, was this really innovative editing that went beyond just filming dance, but rather creating a real cine dance. Okay, so then there was a bit of a transition in her career. So. Along with D.A. Pennebaker, Richard Leacock, and Willard Van Dyke, who are all well-known documentary filmmakers, Clark participated in making short films for the U.S. Pavilion for the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. So this was a really important World's Fair because it was the first one after World War II had ended, and also since the Cold War had begun. So it was a space in which the Soviet Union and the U.S. were competing to demonstrate the superiority of their distinct ways of life. So there was a really interesting controversy that happened at the Brussels World's Fair, which I think is significant in Clark's career. So the people in charge of the U.S. Pavilion wanted to confront the social issues in the U.S. head on, particularly since the desegregation crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, had been all over the international news. They created a section of the exhibition called Unfinished Business, which attempted to grapple openly with the unfinished project of racial integration and harmony in the United States. A major controversy resulted because outraged Southern senators protested and made threats in Congress. They were basically angry at the exhibition for showing integration as a goal, as a social goal, that was even desirable. So ultimately, Unfinished Business was replaced by a public health exhibit. For this reason, Clark's film loops, and she made these looped films of sort of daily life and daily practices in the United States, they became the only place in which African Americans appeared or were even acknowledged in the US exhibition after Unfinished Business was taken down. So I trace Clark's deep interest in both civil rights activism and her later defiance of censorship laws, at least in part to this conflict. After the Brussels Loops, Bridges Go Round was actually made for the Brussels World's Fair, but it was too experimental, so she ended up releasing it just as a separate film. But she was still very interested in city space and in dance, right? And so these films can be regarded as kinds of city symphonies, right? Where the city is the dancer, right? And the editing is what allows the city to dance. So that was what she was up to at the end of the 50s. She also made a film for UNICEF called A Scary Time, but it was so controversial, or it was such an indictment of, I guess, of the United States that in the end UNICEF didn't even use it. So she was always pushing boundaries, right? And frequently her work was a little bit too much for the institutions as they currently existed. Around this time, she decided she wanted to make her first feature film, however. So Her first feature film was based on a play by Jack Gelber that was staged by the Living Theater. And the Living Theater is a really fascinating place. It was this radically experimental theater run by Judith Malina and Julian Beck. And these were sort of very intense people. They believed in breaking down the barriers between art and life as a means of producing a new and better reality, right? A living theater. So she decided to make her first film based on Gelber's play. So The Connection is a really important film. I've taught this film many times, but it can be seen as one of the very first mockumentary films, although it's not funny. But it is framed as the assembled footage from a documentary about heroin addicts that was never finished. The play itself also had this sort of play within a play, but this becomes a film within a film. Clark's film is both a critique, or is a critique of both the very idea that a documentary can represent reality objectively, and of the results when the powerful turn the camera's gaze on those with less power. And it's very self-reflexive. There's a lot of direct address to the camera, and the viewer is sort of directly implicated into the film. So I'm going to show you actually the preview that Milestone Films produced, so you can get a sense of what The Connection looks like and sounds like.
J.J. Burden, New York City. The responsibility of putting together this material is fully mine. I did it as honestly as I could.
Do you realize that hardly a day goes by without some item in the daily press concerning narcotics? What do you want to hear? That we're a petty, miserable, self-annihilating microcosm? That's what you want to hear. Hurry, hurry, hurry! The circus is here. But imagine anyone wanting to use real junkies just to make a move. Wow. Believe me, we're not here for the money.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense. She was always interested in the line between reality and performance. She was also, throughout her career, jazz was a really key element of pretty much all of her films. There's a lot more I could say about The Connection. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A, but there you go. All right, so The Connection was a huge success among Europeans, taking home the International Critics Award at Cannes. However, the US was a different story. A preview screening of The Connection in May 1962 was attended by intellectual and artistic luminaries like James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Lorraine Hansberry, Allen Ginsberg, and Norman Mailer, among many others. However, when the filmmakers tried to screen it in a commercial theater, it was stopped after 2 shows, ostensibly because of the frequent use of the word shit to refer to heroin. The film became a battle against New York censorship laws, and it ultimately won. But in the meantime, it lost most of its American audience, and it never earned back its investors' money. All right, notably, it was through The Connection, the play, and then the film that Clark met Carl Lee. The two fell in love and carried on a love affair that lasted on and off for 17 years. And significantly, it was Lee in great part who made Clark's next film, The Cool World, possible. So right around the time of The Connection's release, the first statement of the New American Cinema was published, and Clark was one of its signers. The New American Cinema was both New York City's answer to the European New Waves, the French New Wave, the Czech New Wave, and so on, and a rejection of Hollywood's address of an audience that could not or did not want to grapple with the complexities of modern American life. In contrast, these filmmakers sought to address those who wanted to ask the deeper questions about what it meant to be human and alive at this particular moment in time. They wanted to create a genuine American art cinema that made back its money but did not have to appeal to the mass commercial audience, and so had true artistic freedom. The Connection was among the few recent models for how this might be accomplished, a low-budget film financed like a Broadway play through individual investors. All right, so this is The Cool World, which I'm going to talk a lot more about in a few minutes, but for now, suffice to say that it, like The Connection, did not shy away from difficult subject matter. So we'll get back to that. The next film Clark made was yet another controversial film, Portrait of Jason, which was quite unlike any other film before it, consisting of an edited-down version of a 12-hour interview of Aaron Payne, also known as Jason Holiday, a black gay hustler and performer who answers questions, does bits from his show, and otherwise talks throughout the film. The great Swedish director Ingmar Bergman called it one of the best films ever made. What continues to fascinate viewers about this film, I think, is the undecidability about what is real and what is performance, both on the part of Jason and that of Clark and Carl Lee, who are the ones asking questions from off-screen. In the end, it is impossible to say what genre of film we have just watched, documentary, fiction, or something somewhere in between. So you can see that that's a theme in her work. I do also briefly want to mention Clark's one collaboration with Agnes Varda, the French New Wave filmmaker, and in some ways I feel like Shirley Clark is the American Agnes Varda. There's a lot of parallels, although Varda had in some ways a lot more support. Varda came to Hollywood only to find herself shut out because she was a woman. So Lion's Love is at least in part an exploration of what it meant to try to make films as a woman in the US in the 1960s, something that they struggled with, both of them struggled with. So right about this time, video technology suddenly became available to consumers. Not easily, it was still a somewhat rarefied medium, but it wasn't just the television studios that had video anymore. So Clark was always interested in new media technologies. So as soon as consumer-grade video became available, she applied for a grant from the Museum of Modern Art to experiment with the new medium. She was living at the time in the penthouse of the Chelsea Hotel and had access to the roof, where she installed a huge teepee structure, which was entirely wired for video transmission. Here, she held workshops and happenings involving video and the notion of play as a heuristic process. So she was very ahead of her time. All the stuff now about play, she was doing it in the 70s. In 1975, Clark decided to finally leave New York and move to Los Angeles. Although she flirted with Hollywood a bit, she quickly realized that it was not for her. Instead, she took a position teaching film and video at UCLA, where she began coaching a new generation of experimental audiovisual artists. She did make one more feature film. She made some shorts, but she made one more feature, which was about the jazz musician Ornette Coleman, right? So return to her interest in jazz. Then in the late 80s, Clark developed Alzheimer's and spent the rest of her life in slow decline. However, she left a legacy in her works and in her effects on many other artists that has not yet been fully recognized. Even 30 years after her death, however, her film The Cool World is extremely difficult to see. Even Milestone Films, which released most of Clark's films and videos as part of their Project Shirley, could not include it in that collection. There are two very poor quality bootleg digital copies that you can find online, or you can rent a VHS tape or 16mm film print from Frederick Wiseman's production company, Tsipora Films. However, Tsipora has not prioritized the preservation or circulation of the film, which is a significant loss to film history and, quite frankly, to American history. So the film is about a young black boy in Harlem whose only goal is to get enough money to buy a gun from a gangster named Priest so that his gang, the Royal Pythons, can defeat a rival gang and he can become the gang leader. So I'm going to play you a clip, but the quality is very poor for the reasons I just mentioned.
Summertime is such a fake. You think, man, it's slow. And before you know it, it's over. fool me. I know I gotta keep moving. Man, I got so much to do. If I want the peace, I got a lot of work to do. Listen, gotta get that peace. I need it. Then I can get things moving again. We become a fighting gang again, like in the olden days. I don't care what anyone else says. The bottom days ain't over. Lots of guys still swinging. Yeah. And then one day, I'll come walking down this street. Everyone will look at me with respect and say, there goes Duke Custis. He's a cold killer. Everybody pays attention and listens to me when I talk. I'll be at the top of the heap. And when I push, they'll stay pushed. Man, you get yourself that peace. You get rid of blood, and you be the biggest man on the streets.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the background of this film. So after seeing the living theater production of The Connection, Frederick Wiseman, already a film lover, decided to invest in a film production based on Gelber's play. Producer Lewis Allen had come up with a financing model, and a woman a few years Wiseman's senior named Shirley Clarke was slated to direct the film. Wiseman was working as a law professor at the time and had a bit of money to spare, so he decided to take a chance on The Connection, and he was pleased with the artistic results, if not the financial ones. Although he had lost money in the end, he had been impressed with Clarke's insistence on fighting against obscenity laws that restricted the reproduction in films of how people actually speak. He was interested in producing a film of his own, and he had recently read and liked a book called The Cool World. The novel by Warren Miller was about a boy growing up in Harlem and was written in the dialect of Black Harlem teenagers. Although Miller was white, he had spent 7 years living in Harlem, listening to kids talk and writing down what he heard. James Baldwin, for one, had written that he had mistaken the writing for that of a black author and called the book one of the best novels about Harlem that he had ever read. Wiseman decided to hire Clarke to direct the adaptation. Although there were plenty of films about juvenile delinquency circulating at the time, this was not like the others. Indeed, at the time of its release in 1964, The Cool World was a radical experiment in collaboration across distinct subcultures within New York City. Although led by a white producer and director, the production of The Cool World foregrounded actual black voices in quite unprecedented ways. This is literally true within the diegesis in that the film appears to be the first American film to not only be focalized entirely through a black character's experience, but also to deploy an internal monologue of a black character in voiceover. But that is not all. Clarke knew that as a wealthy white woman, she could not, on her own, accurately represent the experience of a poor black boy growing up in Harlem. So Clarke collaborated with Carl Lee, who helped her script the film. And Carl Lee is a really interesting figure, just in her story, but also in his own. He was the son of the great actor Canada Lee, and he had grown up in Harlem, but he was also kind of drawn to the criminal underworld and became a drug dealer. But he was also Clarke's romantic partner at the time. So yeah, his story is a sort of side note, but also really fascinating. As important as the scripting was, however, was the casting of the film, which included only a few professional actors. Lee also served as casting director alongside Clarke. For the teenagers who were the center of the story, they auditioned kids who actually lived in Harlem. Although they were not in any strict sense playing themselves, their lived familiarity with Harlem and its gangs meant that they could tell Clarke what felt authentic to them and what did not, and she regularly solicited their feedback. In addition, by allowing the actors to improvise within the scripted scenes, Clarke intentionally gave away a degree of control over the film's form. Clarke wrote of the production, quote, "A great many scenes are improvised. The kids are given a lead-in to what they are to accomplish in general in the scene. At all times, they were asked if this was something they would do or wouldn't do, if they believed it or if they didn't believe it. If they said no, we didn't do it. From all this comes their attitude, not mine, not Carl Lee's, but theirs." In addition, the many street shots of Harlem and its residents offer a sense of documentary space, a record of that place at that time. The final film, however, was made in the editing room, where Clarke's true genius lay. During the editing, the music, written by Mal Waldron and played by Dizzy Gillespie and his band, became a structuring element of the film. So one of the things I've been looking at while I've been at Harvard are June Jordan's papers. As I mentioned, June Jordan became an assistant to Frederick Wiseman on the set, but really what she was doing is she was taking notes on everything that happened and interviewing everybody involved in the production. She wrote an entire manuscript, only part of which was ever published, about this production. So June Jordan had initially been very skeptical of the project, and understandably so. She wondered, who were these rich white people coming into Harlem and filming? What did they know? Were they just going to reinforce the stereotypes that black people in the Harlem ghetto were violent and dissolute? What could they want here, and what could they possibly have to offer? As production wrapped up, and after she had interviewed nearly everyone involved in the production, Jordan still had her reservations. Yet her description of the preview screening held for the cast and other invited guests suggests that what she doubted in the production added up to something more in its reception. Describing a scene of the cast filled with the gleeful laughter of the teenage actors watching themselves in the finished film, Jordan's response was to recognize that although the film was not and could not be real, it was nonetheless true. And I think that more or less sums up something about Clark's whole work as a whole. It was never real. In fact, Clark rejected the very notion of the real, the idea that film could somehow give us the real. And yet, it was at the same time true. Clark had hoped that The Cool World would generate immediate action among white audiences to address the problems facing black Americans depicted in the film. In this she was, perhaps not surprisingly, at least from the perspective of 2023, disappointed. The main audience interested in the film in the end was black. It was praised by black leaders like James Farmer, National Director of the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, by Whitney Young Jr., head of the National Urban League, and Bayard Rustin, director of the March on Washington, as well as by black film critics like Jesse Walker and Albert Johnson. Malcolm X also liked the film. White distributors, however, did not see a profitable return in marketing the films to theaters with predominantly white audiences. Hence, one could argue that the film failed to do what Clark and her collaborators intended it to do. Nevertheless, The Cool World stands as an early indictment of structural racism in the North, as well as the South, an expose of what civil rights victories in court did not or could not address. The production itself, despite its flaws and failures, demonstrated how the avant-garde produced a contact zone within which artists demonstrated a willingness to collaborate across cultural boundaries in the interest of shared values. Indeed, the production of The Cool World exemplifies an openness to working together across difference, an openness from which we might learn if we are to confront the renewed threat of intercultural conflict that we are witnessing today. As Jordan wrote, expressing her surprise at the unexpected insight offered by the finished film, who told Shirley Clark? Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. That was great. So we have a few questions, but we have some time, so do feel free to ask more. Let me see. How did you come across Shirley Clark specifically? And since doing your research of her, is there any part to her life that you personally resonate or connect with?
Yes. Well, I think I first learned about her from Lauren Ravinovitz, who was one of the first scholars to write about her in a book called Points of Resistance. And yeah, I sort of got fascinated starting then. I did a project about Shirley Clark in graduate school, then sort of not forgot about her, but let that go for a long time, and then kind of rediscovered her as I was teaching the connection and got excited about her again. In terms of resonating with my own experience, something I've gotten very interested in is the fact that she was Jewish. I think actually the community that she came from, the particular sort of Jewish subculture in which she grew up, it was really important to her filmmaking. So I've been looking kind of into the history of that community, but also the relationship between that community and the black community, right? Because she worked with black people much of her time, much of her career. And you know, this was a time when there was a lot of tension, or sort of rising tension between those communities. And so that idea of the contact zone between, between subcultures, where there was sort of the possibility of this collaboration, is something that I'm very drawn to as a possibility.
Right. And The next question is, where do we see manifestation of Clark's influence on film, both mainstream and otherwise today?
I mean, I think it's hard to judge. Many filmmakers whose names are better known than hers have mentioned her. I know Martin Scorsese, for instance, said that she was a huge influence on him. She was very important in the career of John Cassavetes, who was making films around the same time, but is much better known. But, I mean, I think her reflexivity, right, the way in which she interrogates the relationship between reality and performance, documentary and fiction, whether that has had a direct influence on other filmmakers, I can't be sure. But I think kind of the overall, her questions have become really central in a lot of filmmakers' works.
Mm-hmm. The next two questions are about the transformation of Shirley Clarke. So you shared that there was a shift for Shirley from getting married into her 40s. What happened?
So I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm still very much in the midst of this research, and if anybody on the Zoom in particular has more information, let me know. But I mean, I think she decided that she wasn't going to be able to be a dancer. She didn't think she was good enough, she picked up this camera. And I'm sure she already had contact with the art world. I mean, the dance world was connected to the film world and everything. I think she started going to screenings at Cinema 16 and taking classes at City College. And if you look at pictures of her during that time, she's sort of slowly transforming. She cuts her hair and, she changes her outfit and everything. So I think she, sort of started to take on a new identity. And then eventually she got divorced from Burt Clark and, started a relationship with Carl Lee. And I think that also, continued to kind of lead her into very different social circles. Although she was really interesting because she crossed many different boundaries in terms of different social groups.
And following up on that, do you have any information on the, let's call it influence, even if I'm sure it's not the appropriate word, of Carl Lee on Shirley Clarke's artistic production and this transformation? So any information that we have on how their relationship influenced their work, her work?
So far, I've found limited information about that. There's not a lot of information about Carl Lee that's easily accessible, to be honest. I think he is kind of a tragic figure. Canada Lee was kind of as close to a superhero as you get in life, and then he basically was a victim of the blacklist. This is during the McCarthy era, and he was very active he's a civil rights activist, but because he was a civil rights activist who did collaborate with communists and people who held communist views and things like that, he basically got branded, a subversive, and I'm still trying to get his FBI file, which the FBI pretends that they don't have. But he was really incredible, and then he died because he was blacklisted. He couldn't get any work. He basically, his health failed, and I think that was a huge blow to Carl Lee, and I think that may have driven him sort of more towards the kind of criminal underworld. In terms of his influence on Clarke's work, I mean, he was certainly integral to the connection, The Cool World, and Portrait of Jason. He's part of all of those. So, but it's a little bit hard to say exactly what's him, what's her, and how his influence was manifested.
Mm-hmm. And continuing the conversation on the influences on Shirley Clarke work, can you speak more to the Ethical Culture School and its potential influence on Clarke and perhaps even her family?
Yeah, so this is something I've gotten very interested in, and I need to actually go to the Ethical Culture School and see what's in their archives, because I have not yet done that. But the ethical culture is, to me, really fascinating because it explains something to me about my own sense of self, I guess, because it really, she was not a religious person, she was not religiously Jewish, and yet I feel like I recognize in many of the values that she spoke about a certain link to Judaism, my own experience of it. a non-theistic one, like really based in ethics and the idea of social justice, right, and of all human beings, having value, and also the need to try to make the world better, those sorts of things. There's an interview in which she says something about, basically, I need to make a contribution. Once I've made a contribution, God will let me die. So again, not like specifically theistic, but this sense of like having a responsibility. And so I trace that, if not specifically to the ethical culture school, to kind of that environment. I don't know that her parents were necessarily interested in that, but that was still that was where they went. The daughters went to school, and if looking at the background of both of those schools, the Ethical Culture School and the Lincoln School, they were not just progressive education, but they were sort of this Jewish progressive education that I think was really crucial.
So you mentioned Varda, but this question asks whether there were other international connections, specifically with European influences in her filmmaking art.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Italian neorealism, Rossellini and Bicycle Thieves, De Sica, those were incredibly influential films worldwide, right? So those were the post-war films made in Europe using location shooting, non-professional actors, kind of everyday stories of everyday life. So I think those were perhaps the most important influence. What was the question about influence on her or her influence back to Europe?
Were there European influences on her filmmaking, just plain and simple?
Yeah, well, so the thing with The Connection is really interesting. So she went to Cannes with The Connection, and it was sort of the surprise hit at Cannes, and she was there with Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky and a whole bunch of the sort of like beat writers, and so there was this kind of, I don't want to say confrontation, but it sounded like there was a meeting of the New Wavers, the French New Wavers, and the Beatniks. And so I found this interesting article where it was like the Wavers versus the Beats. So, there's definitely, like, people were really excited about her in Europe in a way that, I mean, she certainly got recognition in the United States, but I think in some ways she may have been understood better in the European context.
Following the thread on connections now, so could you say a little more about her connection to the music scene, specifically the jazz world, and do you see jazz aesthetics playing out in her films?
I do, and I'm still working through that. But yeah, I think jazz, I mean, it was such an incredibly important art form, in New York at the time she was growing up. I mean, sort of during the period that she was growing up, the Harlem Renaissance was happening essentially a few blocks away, right? So there's no way that she wouldn't have been exposed to jazz early on. But she clearly got very invested in jazz. The Brussels Loops films, so there's an interesting story about those. Apparently the organizers told the filmmakers that they could do anything, but they couldn't do jazz. And so she decided that she would do jazz through the editing. So if you look at the editing of those films, they're done in with a jazz aesthetic. So there's no actual jazz music, but the way that it's edited is jazzy. And it's interesting though, I thought initially it was because the organizers were like anti-jazz, but actually it was because they were using jazz at the time. Most of the performers for the US at the Brussels World's Fair were jazz musicians, actually, because they were sort of being used as cultural ambassadors to Europe at the time, and jazz was being sort of touted as a true American art form, right? There was all of this stress about what it meant to be American and American art at that time, and so jazz was something that was very much central to that. But I think she also just got to know a lot of jazz musicians, right? So if anyone knows jazz, right? I mean, Jackie McLean is in The Connection, and Freddie Redd, and she worked with Mal Waldron and Dizzy Gillespie, and then Ornette Coleman. She kind of knew all of those people, and yeah, so it was clearly a passion of hers, and I'm still kind of tracking exactly how she got into it. There is a can I tell one quick story? The story behind Jackie McLean and Freddie Redd and those musicians being in The Connection was that Jackie McLean had lost his cabaret license because of a drug charge, and so he couldn't play in New York City. So he ended up getting this gig playing for The Connection, right? So for 4 years, he and his band, I think there was some change in the musicians over time, but they played that show for like 4 years and then ended up playing in the film as well. So, there's sort of these interesting ways in which she ended up meeting these people.
I guess, did Shirley Clarke ever discuss her social experiences with Black communities outside of work? And if so, how did those experiences influence her filmmaking art?
That's hard to say. I mean, she certainly felt very, very strongly that, she was very committed to civil rights activism. I spoke with Wendy, said that, her mother was an activist and she would protest things. I mean, she was just sort of very involved in what was happening in terms of civil rights. I'm sort of trying to figure out what happened later on, because I think she also may have, as the shift in rhetoric moved from civil rights to Black power, I think she may have felt less involved or less able to be involved. So I'm sort of trying to track that in her experience. She mentioned, I was listening to an interview recently where she was talking about Leroy Jones, who became Amiri Baraka, and apparently they were friends, but then when he went through his sort of change in identity, he stopped speaking to her, so there was there was conflict there, but I think it was more kind of about this wider shift in the discourse.
Right. Going back to the earlier stage of Clarke's career, do you know whether Clarke's ideas about dance and choreography were shaped by particular theories of modern dance?
That I don't know. I mean, I know which dancers she worked with, and I think Anna Sokolow would maybe be, my sense is that she may have been the most important. And Sokolow was really interesting because she was like a committed communist, and so her dances, particularly the early ones, were, about the death of workers in factories and things like that. But she also had this incredible modernist aesthetic. So she, unlike some dancers who were kind of, regarded as like, oh, they're just the leftist communist dancers. She was a leftist communist dancer, but she also had sort of access to people who weren't interested in the political aspect. So I kind of see Clarke in a way as combining those two elements in her work, right? A kind of committed politics, but also modernist aesthetics, and really looking at form as this generative aspect.
And now there are a couple of questions about specific movies that you mentioned. So the first one is, please tell us more about the issue of Friedrich Waismann's control of the rights of the cool world. And then the second one, and I can repeat it later if you want to, can you say more about The Scariest Thing?
Oh, A Scary Time, that one? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, the Wiseman thing. So Wiseman so far has not spoken with me. I've tried. So my understanding is that he and Clarke did not get along. Basically, Karen Perlman sent me a letter that she wrote to him during the sort of distribution period of The Cool World, which was a very angry letter. I think they got into fights about money. I think she felt like Wiseman disrespected Carl Lee. I mean, there was some real tension there. Why he still won't allow it to be widely distributed now? I mean, she's been dead a long time. This fight, whatever it was a very old fight. I don't know. I don't know what the story is, but I do think it's a problem. He holds the rights to it, but think of all the people involved in this film, right? I think it's beyond just being a piece of art. It's also a historical document, and I think him holding it back is something that is really quite unethical at this point. In terms of A Scary Time, so in some ways it's a sort of straightforward film. She's using this sort of juxtaposition of well-fed American children going trick-or-treating with images of children starving in other countries, which very clearly makes the point that UNICEF wanted to about the unfair distribution of food and resources. But I think it was too shocking. It was basically too much of an indictment, right, of the wealthy countries or the United States.
Yeah. And now we're shifting to a different part of your work, which is the teaching that you do. There is a question about that. What kinds of new challenges and opportunities are you encountering when teaching film courses in college these days, given new forms of media and engagement?
This is a question for me about teaching?
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, so much is changing in teaching right now. I certainly think in terms of teaching film, it's gotten quite difficult to see film the way it's meant to be seen. I think that's actually the biggest challenge. When I got a film degree as an undergrad, I was a 16 millimeter projectionist, and we watched all the films on 16 millimeter. And now I don't think I could get students to come to a screening if I tried. And also, it's very hard. You don't get to screen 16 millimeter prints anymore. So that's certainly a real change. On the other hand, though, the digital access to, Shirley Clarke's films, there's so many on Project Shirley that I would never have seen if it were not for digital technology. So I think that's maybe one of the biggest ones.
Yeah. We have a couple of minutes left. So 2 questions, kind of more personal. So the first one is, how did you find your love of films?
How did I find my love of films? Well, it's interesting because I did not start out as a cinephile. I did not watch television or films almost at all from about middle school until I went to college. I was very suspicious of mass media. And then I went to college and I got really into Marxist theory of, the cultural industry and everything. So I came at it initially as a sort of like critique of ideology. But I think I started watching experimental films, and that's really where I fell in love with film. And I love other kinds of films too. Now I also work a lot on documentary. But I went to Brown University's Modern Culture and Media program, and it was an incredible experience. I worked with Leslie Thornton there, Tony Cokes, really incredible people. So I think, for me, the film that changed my world was called Land Without Bread. It's a Louise Spoonwell film that is probably the first mockumentary, depending on how you understand mockumentary. So that also kind of explains my interest in the connection, because I think they're both kind of similar interrogations of what it means to make a documentary, to watch a documentary, what the ethical implications are in watching other people be themselves or be recorded as themselves.
Yeah. And now a question about your project in relation to the fellowship. Your project seems to be perfectly reached as is independent, I guess. How is the interdisciplinary nature of Radcliffe Fellowship helping make your research even richer?
Oh, that's interesting. Just being with my fellow fellows, I feel like I've learned so many things that I think are all kind of feeding into my research. But, certainly having conversations with people about jazz, for instance, which I really had to give myself an education in because it wasn't something I knew much about. I really had the opportunity to do that here. So that's been a big part of it. And her life is so interdisciplinary in so many ways. She was multimedia, she was part of so many different movements. And, in some ways the challenge for the book project is how far afield to go, because I want to tell her story, but there's all these other stories that intersect with hers.
Just so the audience know, I didn't ask this question. This question doesn't come from me, so it's just from someone in the audience. Well, thank you, Jamie. This is all we have time for today. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for your questions. You can find future programs here at Radcliffe at radcliffe.harvard.edu, and you can also find video of past events there. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day. Oh my goodness.
Thank you.